this after this hour, and I'm hoping to answer as many questions as I can. So thank you, Curaleaf, for sponsoring this. This is such a great content that I'm really, really passionate about. It's a story that not many people know, so I'm excited to tell it, and hopefully folks find out the contributions of the LGBTQIA plus community and cannabis. So who am I? Why am I talking to you? So I'm Rebecca Abraham. I am the owner and founder of Acute on Chronic. We are a cannabis nurse clinic. We do cannabis cards, we do cannabis education, we do cannabis guidance for patient, and we do talks like this for the cannabis industry. We also do presentations for the medical industry. We do grand rounds. Anything your company needs education-wise, we can do. We can train staff, provide dispensary education. So we do a lot of cannabis services at the intersection also of healthcare and patient advocacy. It's something I'm really passionate about. I identify as a bisexual cishet woman, and my pronouns are she, her, hers. What else about me should you know? I was a board certified critical care nurse. I left critical care nursing to do cannabis nursing. I am a certified cannabis nurse. I have a certificate in global women's health leadership from Rutgers University. I'm currently a DNP, so a nursing doctoral student at Northern Illinois University. I'm going to be an NP also, but researcher, which is kind of cool. My focus is actually on medical cannabis and connecting it back to the healthcare field. So that's me. This picture actually was taken to next to Stonewall Inn at an ice cream shop in New York. So I thought it was a pretty appropriate picture for this talk because it's right on the site of everything we're going to be talking about. So first, I'm going to do a quick review of cannabis and the LGBTQIA history. So let's go back to the brief history of cannabis activism. So one of the reasons why I absolutely love giving this talk is I love talking about history and I love talking about cannabis science. And these kind of talks merge both of those together. And I also love talking about grassroots activism. So what is the history of cannabis activism? So cannabis is actually a really, really old plant. People start using it about 3000 BCE. But every 200 years globally, prohibition happens. So cannabis becomes popular. People use it for spiritual health, sexual health. They also use it for pain. It was a very popular medicine even up until 1937 globally, within those 200-year cycles. And what happens is the people start using cannabis and the folks in charge or conquerors come in. They do not like cannabis because they believe that it's going to make the people uprise. They believe that there are behaviors tied to cannabis that they don't like. So then prohibition comes. And then activists, even in the early BCE and CE eras, take on the oppressors or the ruling class, and they get cannabis back. 200 years later, the cycle happens again. So one of the earliest noted historical documentation of the LGBTQ community and cannabis and oppression actually comes around 1300. It comes for other groups of people prior to that. There's a little bit of global religious tension, a little bit of tension between the ruling class of Europeans when Mongolians invade in 1294. But the 1300s is where the Pope gets involved, sees women using cannabis for childbirth, for pain, for sexual health. It's a very popular medicine, and the Pope says absolutely not, accuses these women of having witches' Sabbath under the full moon, having sex and orgies with each other, and says anybody using this substance is a witch and will be burned as a witch. So what happens is then there's an underground movement. Women are still providing cannabis as a medicine to people, and many actually are burned as witches by the church. I am glad I live in this era because I am not being burned as a witch. And I hope we don't go back to prohibition where that would be a possibility. So in the 1800s, globally, all over the globe, we see this happening again. There is a Sons of Cannabis tribe, a very violent tribe in central Congo, and they were always warring with other tribes. They learn how to farm hemp and cannabis, and they actually become very peaceful. They are having lots of sex, no more wars, they're farming better, but the folks around them think they're then weak. Colonialism comes in, the opposing tribes nearby essentially help Britain, the Spanish, other folks who were coming in, and again, you see cannabis become illegal, and then there are uprisings. This also happens in India. When I was reading the history, it sounds very familiar. The British moved into India. They saw that Indians were using bhang for religious expression, for prayer, for tantric meditation. And the British don't like this. They think that it's going to give the working people an idea to overthrow them and uprise. So they prohibit it. A huge uprising happens because people want to keep using cannabis, especially for religious purposes in specific sects of Hinduism. So this uprising happens, and then the British decide to tax and regulate cannabis by giving out farmers licenses. So everything old is new. In the 1970s, this is where the intersection of LGBTQ rights and medical cannabis start merging. In the 1970s, Robert Randall, a glaucoma patient and veteran, is starting to lose his vision, and the only thing that helps him is medical cannabis. He is caught by the police. He goes to court. He says, I need this. And it was true. He really couldn't see without it. So this case went all the way to the Supreme Court, US versus Randall. And he was the first approved medical cannabis patient. His wife, Alice O'Leary Randall, is actually one of the first cannabis nurses. She's been an advocate since, I believe, 1978. And then later in her life became an LPN. She's written a lot of books, and she actually helps the American Cannabis Nurses Association push forward in our work, as well as pushing forward in activism. So a brief history of the LGBTQIA activism pre-1980s and 1990s. And I know I'm going through this very, very quickly. If I had 2 more weeks, I could give you the longest overview of this history that you would like. I would love to do that, but today we only have an hour. So know that I'm skipping over many things and kind of giving the cliff notes of everything. So it's really hard to have activism in the LGBTQ community prior to 1800s. Even the 1800s is extremely dangerous. There is a lot of stigma. There is a lot of weaponizing of religion, really all to most religions regarding this community. So it was very hard to be an activist. Most activists were just either pushed out of society, kicked out of their religious group, or oftentimes harmed in horrific ways. So in the 1800s, you start having clubs, books, poems, intellectuals that are writing about the phenomenon of men loving other men. You have women who say that they have a roommate, that they are both, as it was called in the 1830s and 50s, spinsters. And so this is a little bit of change, but remember, people could not really be out about very much because they would essentially risk everything, including harm to themselves. 1920s, academia actually starts researching sex and gender. This is done in Europe, actually Germany. It's done away with when fascism happens, but it's done at the Kinsey Institute in the United States, and we start seeing a little bit of a movement regarding this. In June 28th, 1969, this is a really pivotal moment for the LGBTQIA community. It was very common in New York and other cities where you had a very high population of LGBTQIA folks, where the police would randomly come in, do raids, arrest people, beat people, and then extort money from them. And just on this one particular day, everyone had had enough. In the late night hours of June 28th, the police came in, did their usual thing, started hitting people. And what happened is the folks who were there actually started fighting back. They threw pennies at the police officers. They started fighting back. They were arrested. But that was really the beginning of the activism movement. After Stonewall, and not that far later, you have the election of Harvey Milk, an otherly open LGBTQIA leaders. So that was a very pivotal moment. That is a picture from Stonewall. It is still open today. You could still visit. It is really a cool place to be. So if you are in New York, definitely stop by. So where does the intersectionality of this come in? It's kind of always been there throughout the last 1,000 years, right? In each one of these waves of prohibition, you see religion, you see the ruling class, you see many, many parties continuously tie cannabis to noncompliance of sexual norms. And it not even LGBTQ, deviation from sexual norms. Women who used cannabis were accused of, being promiscuous. In 1937, this is weaponized again. Dr. Anslinger, who was a real not nice dude, uses this and weaponizes cannabis and says if your wives and your daughters are using cannabis, they are going to marry and have sex with people from other races. We couldn't have that. So this is weaponized over and over and over again. And it's even weaponized. I found this article and it was pretty horrific. Even until 1986, a literal aide to the White House said this statement. It's bad, right? So there's this really huge connection in between stigma between the LGBTQ community and cannabis. Then we get the AIDS. Excuse me. We get the HIV epidemic. And what happens is the government pretty much ignores it. Prior to being called HIV, the term was a pretty derogatory one. It was called GRID for many, many years. And the government did nothing. It wasn't just the government. Most of medicine is pretty guilty as well of standing by and doing nothing as an entire community was dying and suffering. So what happens is ACT UP is started. ACT UP is the organization that was started by patients and their families and had a patient-centered movement to fight back, to get the care that they needed, to get the medicine that they needed. Because they had nothing to lose. There's a couple of really great films on this. There are really great books. NPR had a really great segment from a couple of years ago from some of the activists who did events at Cook County and in New York and in San Francisco they were asked, why did they start this movement? And they said, we were dying. No one cared that we were dying. We were being treated horribly as we were dying. We had nothing else to lose. The photo over here in the corner is actually from one of their die-ins. And so what the activists used to do is they used to cover themselves in blood and lay on the street in front of various parkways to get the attention of the FDA, the government, and even hospitals. And when I say that the medical institution was not much better than the government, many doctors refused to take any kind of drug or past sexual history because they were refusing to treat HIV patients. This is from the New York Times, 1990. It's a really kind of eerie quote. Many physicians declined to accept new and AIDS patients. I try not to use the word AIDS because there's a debate in the community of if this is an outdated, stigmatizing term, but just for context, it was what they said in 1990. So others fail to take sexual and drug histories from patients and neglect to counsel them on how to avoid infection. Experts say few doctors test their patients for the antibodies to AIDS virus, which signals infection. This is at least 10 years, if not more, than when we see the first HIV transmission in the United States. So you could see how horrific and just how devastating this entire epidemic was to a community and how really nobody was helping them, not the medical community, not the government. And so there wasn't a lot of options. So the lack of FDA approval of antiretrovirals did pave the way for cannabis use. And those of us in cannabis and the research community and the medical industry who know that we are seeing really positive findings with cannabis, and we are seeing a lot of really good potential in preclinical trials, but also in human studies globally, we hear that there's not enough research in cannabis all the time, and we hear that it probably doesn't work, and we hear that it's just recreational and that it's harmful. Look at this quote from the FDA about AZT. So AZT was the first antiretroviral that actually helped HIV patients significantly. The research on AZT was vital. Once that got approved, we actually got better and better pharmaceuticals, we got better drugs up until today. And now we have things like PrEP, where now there's even like a prophylactic way to prevent HIV. The FDA said the evidence does. The evidence shows that there's something that it does anything against HIV is not really there. And they were dead wrong. We hear this all the time in cannabis. When I read this quote, I was like, wow, doesn't that sound familiar? So ACT UP goes in to do demonstrations in DC, at various locations and hospitals, government facilities. And in the meantime, what's also happening on the other end is Buyers Club. There's a movie about it, the Dallas Buyers Club. But what these Buyers Club were, it was a way for folks to gain access to illegal pharmaceuticals like AZT that were on trials and sometimes doing trials in other countries. It was a way for them to get holistic medicine, other kind of medicine that wasn't being used in the United States, and cannabis. So cannabis use actually comes from Buyers Club. In fact, a really fascinating thing is these buyer clubs actually set the precedent for dispensaries. So the first dispensary in California that was medical based it off of how they ran the Buyers Club. So when you go into the dispensary today, know that it is literally built from the ground up of Buyers Clubs. So cannabis use was used actually quite a bit in HIV. At first, it was used because there was not access to really anything else. So people were just trying what they had. Turns out, people were talking, had a really good result. Folks noticed that they were eating more. It was helping with wasting syndrome. It was helping with nausea and vomiting. It was helping with really terrible chronic pain. And so word spreads. And so more and more folks with HIV are starting to lean into cannabis because remember, you could get AZT underground, very difficult. And there wasn't really just much you could use. So cannabis becomes big. The first early research and inquiry into cannabis and HIV is as early as 1983. And I have a picture of this book here. And if you remember Mr. Randall Roberts, and nurse Alice O'Leary, the first cannabis medical patients, they actually wrote a book to help the community. So the reason why we have medical cannabis and dispensaries is actually because of these patients, these HIV patients. This was a patient-led movement. They started using it, and much later, physicians, doctors, nurses, and researchers actually start to catch on, and then they start doing the research. Oncology is dabbled in a little bit before this time, but HIV is really the first time where we see a serious look into cannabis. So today, when you go to the dispensary, when you use cannabis, like do a cheers to everyone in that community and HIV community from that time period, because they are who we should be thinking for everything we have in this industry today. And highlight some heroes from this movement. So I love this. So Marsha P. Johnson was so important to the Stonewall movement. She was a friend of Andy Warhol. She gave money all the time to various organizations. She was a fantastic grassroots leader. She did organize many nonprofits and gave a lot of money to HIV and was a supporter of cannabis use for HIV patients. So Marsha P. Johnson's amazing. If you ever want to hear a really fantastic song, Rick Wilson has one called Marsha P. and I to B. It's fantastic. If you ever need to get motivated about activism, cannabis, anything, check it out. Dennis Perrone, his partner had died from HIV. It was horrific to him. He was desperately trying to get medicine for him. He saw that cannabis helped his partner, and he used cannabis prior. He was a Vietnam veteran. He got arrested a bunch of times for using cannabis and just didn't care. And it helped his partner. And then once his partner died, he was really moved to do more. He was instrumental in the proposition in California in 1996 that made cannabis legal. He had lobbied for over 10 years, and he was not a trained lobbyist. He just started doing it. He was just a citizen like you and I, and he just did this. Folks like Marsha P. Johnson helped. And then who else helped him was Mary Jane Rathbun. Mary Jane Rathbun, why do we call cannabis Mary Jane? It's because of this gal. she used to go into the units at the hospital where there were HIV patients. And remember, if you remember the early days of COVID, where nobody wanted to go near COVID patients and they were isolated in a room, if you work in healthcare, you saw this happen. It was only really the ICU nurse going in. No one would go in these patients' rooms just like that, except it lasted for longer. In COVID, we saw this happen to patients for about 3 months. With HIV, this lasted for well over a decade. So Mary Jane not only was lobbying, trying to get medical cannabis, she was arrested multiple times for making cannabis brownies. That's where we get the cannabis brownie from. Going into the hospital and actually taking care of these folks, people who had not had any families, folks whose partners had already died. She was there taking care of him. So Mary Jane, Dennis, and Marsha are rock stars and heroes of the movement. And we really don't talk about them enough, and we should honor them because, again, without these folks, we wouldn't have what we have today. So cannabis and LGBTQIA health. I want to start off by talking about implicit bias and flaws within research and bedside practice. So everything we do in healthcare at the bedside comes from something called evidence-based practice. What that is what medicine and nursing says we should be doing based off of a large composition of randomized control trials. So many, many, many randomized control trials. And what is a randomized control trial? It is a double-blind, often study where you have a control, you remove variables, and you are studying one variable. Now, randomized control trials are not a perfect science. They're great for pharmaceuticals. It is something we should absolutely keep. However, it's not a very broad science. You need other kind of randomized trials. You need other types of studies to have a good, robust view of a scientific method or hypothesis. So evidence-based practice is really closely linked to randomized control trials. So where does the problem begin? Not only does evidence-based practice take about 20 years to implement, and that's 20 years after the research is done, not from the beginning of the research. But unfortunately, most randomized control trials are done on white cisgendered males between the ages of 25 and 65. So that sure leaves out a lot of people. So a lot of our modern medicine is actually based on these heavy, heavy RCT trials only on one part of the population. And we see the pitfalls of this pretty regularly in medicine. If you remember to the early 2000s and 1990s, we had women dying of heart disease significantly faster than men, and it was exactly because of this. It was because women were not studied. Women present extremely differently when they have a cardiac event than men do. The pain that we are taught as cardiac pain was based on what men feel, and white cisgendered males between the ages of 25. Chest pain, the grabbing of the chest, the elephant is sitting on your chest, that is a very gendered male symptom. For women, it's very different. They feel nausea most of the time. It feels like a gastric upset pain. So that's just one example of how things are missed because of this kind of myopic view. And then I also want to say, when I talk about the gender differences in research, another problem we have, and this I bring this up a lot, especially when talking about sexual health, is there is no question of if somebody's cisgendered or not. There is no question about sexuality, what community they're in, and there is really no question about if they are non-binary. And there's very few studies on trans folks and non-binary folks, and anybody who doesn't fit into this binary paradigm. Also, it has to be said, racially, medicine isn't doing much better there either. When we do cancer studies and oncology studies, folks who identify as other races or are other races just are not studied. So big problems in medicine. And where does this leave the LGBTQIA community? Well, the first thing I want to talk about that I think is, I wish I didn't even have to have the slide. It's kind of horrific that in 2022 I have to. But staying safe while in the hospital as a cannabis patient and an LGBTQIA identifying person. When we have patients come to our office and we're counseling them, we always encourage folks to talk to their doctor and to tell them about cannabis use. And we always say, if you don't feel safe disclosing complete cannabis use, downgrade to CBD, just say CBD. CBD has more drug interactions than THC. CBD is now legal, so just say CBD. The problem is most people don't understand the difference between THC, CBD, cannabis. Many people still using the word marijuana all over the place. So telling your doctor sometimes is a very difficult thing to do for patients, and we understand that. The reason why we encourage folks to tell them is to break stigma, and also because there's over 100 drug interactions. So it is pretty important for your doctor to know. And then we could also grow with science, and you, the patient, can be safer. However, when folks belong to communities that statistically and based on many, many peer-reviewed studies have worse outcomes based on stigma and bias, my recommendation changes. So personal safety first before anything else. Of course, we want doctors to know about cannabis use, but your personal safety is vital because there is discrimination just from the get-go, unfortunately, in healthcare, oftentimes against folks from the LGBTQIA community, against the BIPOC community. So if you feel like you're already being discriminated against, I would not say anything. Other reasons, legal trouble. Even in legal states, this is really sad too. Even in recreational legal states, legal sometimes doesn't mean legal for everyone. In legal states, people have lost their children. People have been accused of being substance abusers. So they could get in trouble, for driving. So if you trust your physician, if you are in a trusted healthcare system, then absolutely let your doctor know. But if you have any inkling that you don't trust that you are in a safe place, or if you get like a bad vibe, just don't disclose that you are a medical cannabis patient or using cannabis. What you can do, how to prevent any harm to yourself. So hiring an advocate is great if you have the funds. Unfortunately, most people don't have those funds. So get a friend to be by your bedside to advocate for you, a family member, or even though you might not be feeling your best, advocate for yourself. Sometimes when clinicians and nurses have bias, it really can cloud the rest of care. As a nurse who works in cannabis, I see this quite often. A lot of bad medicine is done, oftentimes even unintentionally, when a physician hears cannabis. I've seen multiple misdiagnoses because somebody said the word cannabis, where folks go to the ER, say, I use cannabis, are then diagnosed with cannabis hyperemesis syndrome with no workup, sent home, only to come back with appendicitis. So do your best to advocate for yourself. If you are being told that your illness is just cannabis, ask why, ask what else they're thinking as a diagnosis for why you feel bad. And the other reason why it's okay to omit if you feel like your personal safety is at risk is what's great about cannabis, and why I work in this field, is cannabis is a pretty safe substance. So there is little to no risk in not disclosing, especially because, so while there are many, many drug interactions, most of them are benign except for a handful. And while you're in the hospital, in the United States, at least, we don't have laws that allow cannabis to be used in the hospital. So while you're there, it won't make much of a difference. And so your safety and care is important. Like I said, I wish I didn't have to say this slide, but unfortunately, it doesn't even matter if you're wealthy, if you're not, if you are part of a handful of various communities, including the LGBTQIA plus community, you are at risk for bias at the bedside, and that sometimes affects care. So definitely be safe. Advocate for yourself as much as possible. When I was a bedside nurse, when I had patients who were very forthright about things that they were concerned about, things that they wanted me to do, I didn't get mad. I understood. So most nurses are very accommodating to this. If you have a nurse that you feel like is treating you poorly, based on any sort of demographic, report them to the charge nurse, ask for a new nurse. Same thing with your physician, and don't hesitate to advocate for yourself. So I'm going to go through the many ways that let me be sure that I didn't skip a slide. I did not. The many ways that cannabis can help us, particularly in the LGBTQIA community. So I show this very complicated, crazy looking graph. It's my favorite graph. If you've seen talks from me before, you will see this graph over and over again. I like that it's a pretty simplistic drawing. As simplistic as the complicated endocannabinoid system can get of how cannabis works on us and our bodies, right? So in this little square here is called the endocannabinoid system. This is within our central nervous system. This is what makes cannabis work. So I'm about to tell you about 10 different things that cannabis is going to help with. And it sounds crazy. It sounds like snake oil. It's not, and it's because of this graph. So why does cannabis work on so many things? The first reason is it goes up to this little blob there. That's called the hypothalamus pituitary adrenal axis. And what that is that is where a lot of our hormones and neurotransmitters sit. And it's kind of like the motherboard and software of our bodies, right? It controls various neurotransmitters like serotonin. It controls, if I were to draw a line off to the other side, it controls our sex hormones. If you look over there where you see stress and a arrow down, cannabis, when it talks to the HPA system, helps regulate cortisol, insulin resistance, things like that, helps control our circadian rhythm. If you've heard people say cannabis helps me sleep, cannabis helps me stay awake, it's not because it's magically helping you stay awake like caffeine or fall asleep like Ambien. It's because cannabis works on our circadian rhythms. So overall, I'm sure I'll do another talk this year on the endocannabinoid system, but just know the endocannabinoid system strives to regulate everything in our body. And then for visceral sensation and inflammation, these two pathways going from left to right, that's how cannabis controls pain. Cannabis is actually an incredibly strong anti-inflammatory, works just as well as ibuprofen, but really zero of the side effects. Ibuprofen is one of those drugs. Lots of people use it. Everyone has used it from time to time. It's over the counter. People use it daily, but there can be pretty spooky side effects from ibuprofen, from kidney failure all the way to GI bleeds, increased stroke and cardiac risk. So even though something is over the counter and seems very safe, sometimes there's always risks. A doctor said to me the other day, there's no free lunch in medicine. So that's even true with ibuprofen. What's nice about cannabis is there is a little bit of a free lunch so far. And then also bowel motility, appetite, and anti-nausea effects come from the gut and from our brain. So your cannabis specialist in your life is not crazy. There are absolutely a variety of things that cannabis can do, and this map tells us why. So saying that, sexual health. Cannabinoid receptors are found in the prefrontal cortex, the amygdala, the hippocampus, all of these parts of the brain that control our sexual function. And I have to, again, apologize for there just aren't any robust studies regarding non-binary people and regarding the transgender community and sexual health. So please know when I say women, I am referring to women who were born as the gender female and identify as women, because that's all we have in these studies. Hopefully, the next time I give a talk like this in a year, I will have more studies to show for folks who are identifying in other communities. So in this study, women who partake in moderate amounts of cannabis report a heightened sexual experience. As long as they are cannabis users, they actually have more sex, they have more just much better sex, higher rate of orgasm, and there is no decrease to lubrication. Cannabis does dehydrate. That's because it vasodilates and it does dry out our mucous membranes. Somehow it doesn't dry out vaginal secretions. So it's kind of the plant just being pretty cool and leaving alone the one mucous membrane that helps with sex. For men, again, I apologize for the kind of really one-gendered study. Again, hopefully, again, in a year or two, that will be corrected. But cannabis is a pretty potent vasodilator. So what else is a vasodilator that we use? Viagra. So cannabis could possibly in the future, and sometimes some men report that it does help with erectile dysfunction, as well as keeping an erection. The things we have been told about cannabis harms men's sexual health is actually nonsense and has never, ever been proved. So cannabis is a potent vasodilator, and that's why it does a little better than Viagra. Sorry, let me correct myself. The reason why cannabis does a little bit better than Viagra, it does the same mechanism of action as Viagra, but less side effects. I didn't say that part. So Viagra can actually cause a lot of eye problems. It could make you go blind. You can have retinal detachment, kind of bad stuff. If you have any sort of mild sexual dysfunction or erectile dysfunction, taking a look at cannabis might not be a bad idea because just like with ibuprofen, significantly less risks. So I have this chart talking about the difference in between women and men. Again, sorry for being so closed with the genders. But women have more sex when they use cannabis. Men do too. Women seem to have more. If I were to deep dive into this, women do react better in the research to cannabis than men do. They just have a better success so far regarding pain control, sexual function, all sorts of things. And then for women, or folks who were born assigned female at birth, what seems to happen is the hormonal cycle that varies through months really affects women. The reason is when you ovulate, you are actually more susceptible to THC, and right when you're getting your period, you actually absorb less THC, and then this changes throughout the life cycle. And then drug interaction. So PrEP. So PrEP is something that came from AZT. Remember the thing that the FDA said had no purpose? So PrEP is used to act as a prophylactic for HIV, and there's no interaction found between PrEP and cannabis or CBD. So if you were worried about that, no need to. At this point, there's nothing that says it's a concern. HIV still, unfortunately, affects this community at very high numbers. So good news. Many studies show that cannabis shows improvement in pain, anorexia, and neuropathy. Hooray. I'm not even going to deep dive into it because these are the things that are very commonly known. If you work in a dispensary, if you work in healthcare, you see people saying this all the time, and we have plenty of studies to prove it. Several studies, more interesting things, also showed a reduction in inflammatory markers, that's inflammation, and this has been tied to improving outcomes related to heart attacks and neurocognitive impairment. So there are many studies, not only in HIV, but in other sections of medicine that are starting to show that cannabis may be cardioprotective as well as neuroprotective. More to come on that, but pretty cool stuff is happening. And then this study, I was pretty fascinated with. One study showed that daily cannabis use in folks who were prior IV drug users actually reduced the viral load in 1 year after they converted from IV drug use to daily cannabis use. So a reduction in viral load is really important in HIV because the lower you could keep your viral load, the better you do, the healthier you stay. So that's fantastic. I didn't include one study. I just wanted to point it out because I think it's pretty cool. So different doses of cannabis and different doses of THC do different things. Cannabis is it's the kind of drug where it could be an antiemetic, but it could also be a proemetic. So it could stop nausea, but if you do the wrong dose of THC, it could make you vomit. What we see happening in cannabis in one HIV study, I would like more studies on this. And actually in one study, HIV patients that use cannabis actually saw an increase in some of their white blood cells. So their immune system improved. And then in COVID, to contrast, we actually saw cannabis suppressing the immune system and actually helping people survive COVID by preventing cytokine storms. So this is one example where we see cannabis can literally do two different things at once. And the hypothesis behind that is the endocannabinoid system strives to regulate. So whatever is going wrong in your body, you give yourself plant-based cannabis and it tries to kind of mediate that back to what homeostasis should be. Again, some of these things are theories and preclinical studies and animal studies, and we do need more. The things shown here were human studies, particularly with the pain, anorexia, and neuropathy. So transgender community, cannabis can help a lot here. When folks are using hormone replacement therapy, there can be a lot of uncomfortable side effects. So cannabis is very linked to those hormonal pathways. And what we see is cannabis controls thermal regulation. So if you are on HRT and you are feeling discomfort, cannabis can absolutely help with that. It can prevent hot flashes, also helps anxiety. How does it control hot flashes? TRPV1 peripherally, that is a cool little neurotransmitter. And then cannabis talks to the part of our body that affects thermal regulation. So it literally decreases your overall body temperature, and on your skin makes you feel a little cooler. Remember when they told us that cannabis wasn't cool or didn't make us cool? They lied to us like they lied to us about everything else. Cannabis indeed does make us cool because of thermoregulation and how it relates to hypothermia. And this is a healthy hypothermia that just briefly cools you off. The other great thing about cannabis is cannabis helps folks with anxiety and PTSD. There aren't any strong studies quite yet regarding gender dysmorphia or body dysmorphia in the trans community and non-binary community. However, if we look to other studies, we do see that cannabis is linked to an overall decrease in anxiety and PTSD. And why is that? So if you look here, 5-HT, this is serotonin. That is stimulated by your Prozacs, your Zolofts, your SSRI class. Cannabis actually stimulates that same exact molecule, decreasing anxiety, boosting serotonin. Cannabis also boosts dopamine as well. So if you are, having anxiety over body dysmorphia or PTSD from trauma, know that cannabis can help. And people say, well, which cannabis helps with what? Like, I have pain and I have body dysmorphia and I have anxiety. What we tell people is cannabis is this really neat plant where it's not like a pharmaceutical. It's actually a very different way of thinking. In pharmaceuticals, you have one drug per problem. In cannabis, sure, do you have to use maybe a couple of different things at different dosages for an entourage effect? Perhaps you do, but know that it covers all your bases. So if you are using an edible during the day, if you are vaporizing at night, if you are taking CBD when you wake up, know that all of those things are helping multi-problems. So hot flashes, anxiety, pain, it's all being covered under those three different things. So you don't have to, it's not like you have to take CBD for one thing and CBG for another. They're all synergistic and they all want to work together. So let's look back at the ACT UP activism, right? And this is where I want to kind of conclude on before I take questions. I know I talk too much, so I wanted to leave a lot of time for questions because I know I could tangent on about many, many things if I haven't already. So what can the cannabis activists and LGBTQIA activists learn from ACT UP, moving both movements forward? This is real art from that time. Keith Haring was an artist. ACT UP drew this. You may be familiar with Rent. When you hear them say ACT UP fight AIDS, if you were under 40, you probably didn't know what they were saying, but ACT UP is this. So they really got into the social popular culture and social consciousness of various communities and countries. So silence is death. They oftentimes use the pink triangle as representation. This was something that was actually used by fascists to discriminate against the community. And they took it back as a symbol of power at demonstrations to show people that they were not just going to essentially take the ignoring of an entire community and the deaths of their peers. So what made ACT UP actually work? What can we do? So what made ACT UP work is three ingredients, and nothing like ACT UP has actually been seen since. So what the first ingredient is achieving a focused mental terrain within. What does mental terrain mean? As an organizer, what that means is you change the hearts and minds of the community. So this could be one-on-one chatting, what HIV patients did is they talked about what it was like to be a patient, what it was like to be not to have any health care. And they literally talked to even strangers on the street, friends and neighbors, just saying, like, this is what it's like to be gay or lesbian in 1984 and have HIV. And look at me, look at my partner, like, we're dying, like, you know us, we're gardening next to you. Changing hearts and minds made a huge difference. Then the next thing they did is they had unapologetic activism. So that picture I showed of the people covering themselves in blood and lying down, that gets attention. That makes the powers that be make you want to go away, get off my lawn. Really disrupts their day. It's very disrupting. So the folks in charge do not like when people do that. If we see this today in some of the tragic events that happen, you always hear people say, like, "Oh, no, 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 don't protest. That's not what we want." And it's because it's annoying. Because they say that because if you bothered them enough, they would change. And that's for any political issue. And then the third reason that ACT UP worked is when ACT UP finally got meetings with the FDA and Dr. Fauci. Yes, he was there at the time. You had pressure outside, you had those folks doing the die-ins, and then you had folks on the inside in front of policymakers who knew the research, who knew the studies, who knew exactly what they were asking for. So when you get in front of policymakers, know your stuff, know your research. I always tell people when they're about to engage in grassroots organizing or lobbying, you know more than the politician, especially if you are not in the legal realm, if you are in medicine, if you are in cannabis, if you are in construction, you more than likely know a heck of a lot more about the topic you're lobbying for than the person you're talking to. So those three ingredients is what made ACT UP very successful. And cannabis organizers should indeed actually do the same thing to get cannabis descheduled from Schedule 1. It's nonsense that it's there because we do have FDA-approved pharmaceuticals. We have Epidiolex, we have Sativex, we have Marinol. So there is a therapeutic use. So it's absolutely bonkers to say that there is no therapeutic use. And we have a similar situation, not as grave and of course not as severe. You can't compare anything to the AIDS epidemic. You just can't. But there are people who are dying from a lack of cannabis care. We see this actually in pediatric seizure disorders. In the 80s, over 30 years ago, I think it was like 1989, 1990, we actually did see in clinical research that CBD protected kids from having long detrimental seizures that would kill them. No one talked about this study for 35 years. So how many children, how many adults had died because nobody did the research? Because again, it was ignored by the FDA. And something I didn't cover in this talk is cannabis has been prohibited because of political reasons. It was not like the opioid crisis. No one ever got hurt from cannabis. You can't die from it. There's no lethal dose. So know that this is also an ethical issue too, because cannabis could really be a lifesaver for so many patients for a variety of disease processes. And we can't do research because if it's restricted, and they say it's restricted because they don't have the research, and it's just all nonsense. We have plenty of research. We have 20,000 studies, and we know that cannabis is safe. So do we need more specifics? Absolutely. But overall, we have a safe substance that could be really helpful for folks. So I do believe it is time for both communities, the LGBTQ community as well as the cannabis community, to take lessons from ACT UP and replicate them to get the things that we need and want for the cannabis community and for medical cannabis patients. So again, I'm Rebecca Abraham. I am the president and founder of Acute on Chronic. I work with many very intelligent, lovely, fantastic, caring nurses that are on our team. We are available in all 50 states and even some other countries. So you can contact us. This is my email. And then you could always go to our website to book an appointment. And now I am ready for any questions that you have. I haven't looked at the time in quite some time. Okay, I have a little bit of time. I didn't go over. Amazing. So I'm gonna switch over. All right, and then I'm gonna go back to Teams. Here I am. Hello. And then let me see if I can, oh, I'm going to look at the chat. Can I see the chat? Sorry, everyone. I was looking at my slides for so long, and I've become a Zoom gal in the pandemic. So, okay, I'm going to show all participants. Cool. Just if you have the power to unmute yourself, do it, and we'll just go in that order. It'll be very chaotic.
I did put something in chat asking about strain specifics. Like, for instance, I live Durban, but it doesn't help my brother. We both have osteoarthritis and other things. So what do you see as far as like strain specific for people? Because that really does play a role in all of this.
Yeah, that's a really great question. So terpenes, for those who are newer to cannabis in the audience, so what makes a strain is the terpenes. So that is the essential oils of cannabis. We don't have enough science on strains to really specify what is best at this point. What we have is patient data and just kind of what the community says. So my favorite strains. I like things that are high in beta carotene. There are a lot of separate studies that show the benefits of that. Myrcene is literally in everything in the American cannabis market. You can't get away from myrcene if you tried. So know that that's always a component. And then I think limonene does a lot of good for PTSD, anxiety, and beta carotene. I think those are my three favorite. And favorite strain for sour diesel OG. We do need more research, but I always tell patients, like, we have really strong research about cannabinoids, still not as strong as I would like, but the terpenes we have even less. So we're plucking from research in various sciences.
Perfect. Thank you, Rebecca.
Yeah.
That was a great response. I do have to plug in the fact that SC Labs is trying to combat that. They have a vital facts report that is complimentary whenever anyone tests their terpenes and cannabinoids with us. And that gives you that illustrative graphic of what the entourage effect can be expected. So you see your 3 top notes in colors for the terpenes, just like your wines. And that is how you can start finding those unique ratios that will work with the endocannabinoid systems that are treating certain conditions there. So we'll be seeing that more and more, I'm sure.
That's awesome to know.
I was just going to say the same thing. That's wonderful. Thank you. Just to put in a note, I broke my back in my sleep and I'm in a wheelchair and it's due to gluten, but I've learned how to walk. This is my 11th time, and I always say I walk because of cannabis. I mean, it helped through everything. So, and they're much more open in the hospitals. They weren't in home health care. Home health care honestly sucked and wanted to dictate how I did my medicine.
Yeah, I'm so sorry. Yeah. And it really is facility by facility is what I'm noticing. California has a really great law now called Ryan's Law, where hospice nurses and I think ICU nurses are able to give cannabis now in the facility if you are terminal or if you are actively dying. So that is a step in the right direction. I have worked with facilities that have been open to it, depending on who their medical director is. And we've seen really great results in the facilities. So it's a real shame that people are like close to it, like in dementia. We've seen fantastic results with patients, decreasing for polypharmacy, getting off many, many meds, having a fantastic quality of life, not being confused anymore. So I'm sorry that happened in home health. Home health seems like a place where they would be more open to it because it's your home, like
exactly.
Who cares? Yeah. So I'm sorry I can't see the chat. I'm clicking around a little bit. Is there anything in the chat? Any questions in the chat that I'm missing or anything?
Yeah, we have. There is one. Seen issues with estrogen therapy and cannabis.
Issues with estrogen therapy and cannabis. That's a fantastic question. Probably no. So if you are on HRT, and particularly if it's estrogen, there is a slight interaction, but nothing to write home about. And remember when I say slight interaction, so when I'm looking at an interaction, I'm super conservative about it. Our nurses are super conservative about it, and it's because we're in a new science. So I believe the interaction off the top of my head is cannabis increases the estrogen in the estradiol. Organically, if we're talking about natural estrogen that we make, assuming you have ovaries, is cannabis may decrease estrogen. And when we decrease estrogen, that's when folks feel anxious, where it's difficult to sleep. So that's the organic interaction, is it likely decreases. With HRT therapy, I actually believe it increases the circulating amount of estradiol. What to look out for that? So the old HRT medications, I don't necessarily think they're being used anymore, although for folks transitioning, it may be different. There were a class of HRT medications that were tied to cardiac risk. So I would say, if you feel safe, if you are using cannabis and you are on any hormone replacement therapy, just to keep an eye out for side effects, watch your vital signs, keep an eye on your labs. You can't help for genetics, of course, but try to have healthier risk factors. If you have a safe physician, talk to them about it. Although something that we're starting to tell people, unfortunately, is we always kind of tell people, like, most people who get into healthcare, we all mean well. Unfortunately, with cannabis, there's a lot of blinders on, and people always default to scared and stigmatizing. So when patients get scared, I have them, if they talk to their doctor and the doctor has something negative to say, I actually ask the doctor to call us or the patient to tell us what was said, so we could either educate the doctor or agree. Not everything in cannabis is perfect. No free lunch. Just in cannabis, there's a heck of a lot more free lunch. So I hope that answers your question. I believe
That's awesome that you do that, by the way.
Oh, yeah. No, thank you. Also, it likely decreases progesterone. So if you're trying to conceive, it may affect that. But again, we don't know. These are guesses off of preclinical studies. So we do need more robust studies there. I believe it may increase testosterone as well. So, and thank you. Yeah. It's, part of our mission at Acute on Chronic is, why we all do this. The physicians that work with us, the nurses, is we can see that cannabis may be a fantastic future therapeutic, definitely for symptom control. I would bet my entire house on it and my kidney, that as soon as we have science, it's going to prove to probably be a better medication and supplement than probably ibuprofen. I will bet on that. But there's probably a variety of uses we haven't even tapped. So I'm very passionate about breaking stigma. And of course, what brought me to cannabis initially, I don't get to tell the story often, is I wanted to be a patient advocate. Working in the hospital can be a very frustrating thing in America. We have a lot of broken systemic things, for-profit healthcare and private equity dipping into safety net hospitals has done a lot of damage. And so I just saw people of many communities being harmed just by, lack of training about certain things. You look at mortality. It's hard not to talk about this. The morbidity and mortality of Black women after they give birth. I believe you have like a 1 in 6 chance of dying. That's something caused by the systemic troubles we have in healthcare, So being an advocate for people is something I was really passionate about. And I've been also passionate about cannabis. So when the delightful American Cannabis Nurses Association, when I saw they existed, when I saw they had a certification, I was like, yeah, I'm going to do this. And so it does really link everything I love: new science, challenging science, and advocacy, because you can still see in our patient population, our demographics, there are still a lot of folks from Black and Brown communities who are terrified to tell people that they use cannabis, who are even terrified to get cannabis care. And it's because of stigma, it's because of the legal risk. So it's something that I'm really passionate about moving forward with, and growing a science and decreasing a stigma and growing advocacy for patients.
I admire you so much. I'm your biggest fan, and I'm so thankful to know you.
Thank you.
Oh man, but you just blew me away with the fact of women's menses cycles and how
Yeah.
that can kind of change and shift the way that the cannabis works with women during those different stages. I never knew that. I want to learn more about that.
Yeah, absolutely. It's fascinating science, and it changes a little fast sometimes. And feel free to shoot off more questions. I could talk and talk forever. But I'm always happy to do this again. So if you know anybody, I'm so grateful that Curaleaf sponsored this. But no, we love educating, and this is really the only way where we're going to break through. We do try to do research and go to these traditional medicine conferences, and the questions we ask are, we have a long way to go. When I go to cannabis conferences, I get amped. I'm like, yeah, the future is now. This is legit medicine. We're doing it. We're saving lives. And then I'll go to a traditional medicine conference and I'll hear like substance abuse with cannabis. Oh, but they call it marijuana is up. And I'll just be like, oh my God, I forgot that we're this far behind. So lots of work to be done, but we're doing it. And if you look at the strides the LGBTQ community made, Stonewall was not that long ago, and now we have folks getting married. If what happened at Stonewall happened today, it would be a scandal. It would be a politicized scandal, but it would be a scandal. You can't do that anymore. So we've come a really long way, and even with cannabis, the first cannabis presentation I ever did was in 2007 as a nursing student, and I thought I was in big trouble. I was scared to do it. I was very concerned about the future of cannabis. And if you told me I would be sponsored by a multi-state corporation to discuss the health and health disparities related to cannabis use and various communities, I would be shocked. So we've come a long way in 14, 15 years, and I'm optimistic that this is going to grow faster. So. And then if you think of any more questions or anything we can do, so this will be recorded. So if somebody missed it, I believe Curaleaf's going to post it on their site, and it's recorded, and we will have it, and we're happy to share it throughout anybody who'd like it. And we're going to be doing more of these with Curaleaf sponsorship. Thank you again. I believe we have another one in October, and then we may have one over the summer. So really excited to be doing this and providing education and growing the science and advocating for patients. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. It was a great presentation. Looking forward to the rest.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
These are my pinhole glasses. Talk about natural approaches.
Yeah. Thanks, everyone. And then
great.
Thanks, Lisa. Yeah, and then email me any questions and share. So thanks, everybody. I'll stick around just in case anybody thinks of a question or anything that they need.